Let me start by saying welcome to the webinar, Bridging Culture and Brand with Archetypes. We're really excited you decided to join us. My name is Cynthia Forstman, and I'm one of the co-founders of CultureTalk. Obviously, brand and culture are big topics these days, and I'm excited to introduce Teresa and JP. Actually, I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute here, who are going to talk about the work that we're doing in this area. So once again, we are recording this session, and we will send out a link afterwards so you can see the slides and hear the messages again. And I also wanted to let you know that after Teresa and JP present the material they have to share, we will have time towards the end for your questions. We did get a couple of questions that came in advance, but if you have additional questions as we go through the course of this, I will take those questions in the chat pane and look forward to sharing more. JP, I have unmuted you, and Teresa, I have unmuted you, so I will pass the baton your way.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Cynthia. This is Teresa speaking, and I'm just going to introduce myself and allow JP to do the same. So I am also a co-founder of CultureTalk, and CultureTalk is an organization that offers 2 online assessments, which you'll hear more about today. And I am also a co-founder and partner at Allegory Studios. And that's the place where a lot of the work that you're going to hear about today was born. It was the proving ground for the CultureTalk system. So it's a brand development and management consulting firm, Allegory Studios, and we've been around for over 18 years at this point. I'm really excited to share this presentation today with JP Lacour of Brand Foundation, and I'm going to ask him to tell us a few words about himself.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Really a pleasure to be here. Thank you guys so much. And thanks to everybody who took time out of their day today, whether they're at work or on vacation, to join us. As Teresa mentioned, my name is JP Lacour. I'm one of the partners at Brand Foundations, and we are a strategic brand and culture consulting organization. I've been in marketing and branding since about 1990 across a variety of B2B sectors, finance, technology, et cetera. Started my own agency in 2002 and pivoted in 2012, about 10 years into it, to focus more specifically on brand and culture, recognizing that that's where we could have the biggest impact on the health and valuation and performance of companies. And I'm happy to say I'm a CultureTalk certified partner since February this year, and we'll talk a little bit about that certification process at the end of the call today too. So with that, let's jump into the agenda. Like many of you on the call today, we are in our roles in charge of selling the value proposition of brand and culture. And that can be a difficult thing to do. Many of you are probably familiar with that in terms of getting the C-suite to buy into it. So we're going to talk first. I'm going to take you guys through some of the financial impact and measurements of culture and brand on organizations. And then Teresa's going to do a little deeper dive into defining what we mean by culture, and then present an archetypal case study of Wells Fargo using archetypes as a way to understand kind of what happened there. And then I'm going to take you through some practical uses of the archetypal system in the work that we're doing at Brand Foundations and Brand and Culture before I turn it back over to Teresa to talk a little bit about the system itself and some of the opportunities like certification that we mentioned earlier. So with that, let's jump into it. So I wanted to kick off the conversation today with this quote from Lou Gerstner. Culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. And Lou famously led the turnaround of IBM in the early 1990s, long before culture was in vogue, at least to the degree that it is today. But interestingly, right in the middle of the birth years of the millennial generation, which is having such a big impact on workplace culture today. And in one of the most complex and challenging turnarounds in history, really, a turnaround that included 100,000 layoffs at a company that had a 100-year history of quote unquote lifetime employment. Gerstner knew back then that the truth about culture, which is that there was no bigger game in town. And he recognized both the risks and the rewards that lay in culture. We're going to talk a little bit about both. So recently, we've had a number of reminders that there is no bigger downside risk to culture. And let's look at a couple of the examples and the financial impact that they've had. So Wells Fargo is one we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on later in the program. But there are a couple of statistics that jump out that or publicly available that they released that talked about the immediate impact after the scandal broke last fall about retail branch operations opening accounts without the permission of customers. And they saw in the months after that a 41% decrease in the number of checking accounts opened, a 45% decrease in credit card applications. And just as concerning were results of the Harris poll this year that came out of the top 100 company reputations, where Wells Fargo tumbled from number 70 to number 99, literally the bottom of the list. The CEO has been forced to step it down, and some analysts estimated it'll cost north of $2 billion in terms of fines and just overall impact to the organization. So huge financial impact. We're going to dive deeper into how this happened a little later. But I also want to look at another example, United Airlines. We all saw the viral video that came out back in April of a passenger being forcibly removed. And in just a matter of days afterwards, United saw, its parent company saw about $1.5 billion of valuation vaporize. That's 6.3% of the entire value of the company. And even positive sentiment is measured by Brandwatch on a day-by-day basis, dropped in one day from 90% positive association with the brand to 32%. So huge impact both financially as well as reputationally to United. And then finally, we've got Uber, which has had a number of scandals over the last 3 years, ranging from the frat boy antics of its CEO to complaints of sexual harassment, run-ins with its own drivers, conflicts with state regulatory authorities. And they've not only lost significant market share to Lyft, some of the statistics you see here, but they've now lost their CEO. And that Delete Uber campaign that we saw launched in January of this year led to 200,000 account deletions in just 6 days. I was one of those people who deleted that account. Maybe some of you were. It was just so easy to do and satisfying to some degree. And I think that's part of the danger of a culture mishap in today's world. The impact can be large and nearly instantaneous.
Yeah, JP, it's interesting. I actually did sort of a informal market research survey myself a couple of weeks ago. I had an opportunity to pick up a Uber to the Atlanta airport and got talking to the driver, who is contracted to both Uber and Lyft. And he candidly shared that hands down, he preferred working for Lyft. And there were a number of reasons, but primarily it stemmed from the way that the drivers were treated. And there was a stark difference between those two companies. And he also shared that many of the other drivers in the space who drive for both companies share that feeling.
Right. I've heard the same thing and had similar conversations as I talked to some drivers. A very distinct difference that they perceived in the culture between Uber and Lyft. So I think it's painfully clear that culture has downside risks, real financial bottom line risks to any enterprise. But what's the upside potential here? And we believe there's plenty of that too. And here's some interesting statistics. A study done by KPMG just a few years ago showed that on average, across literally every industry, the percentage that is paid for a company in its acquisition is typically 50% goodwill. And goodwill is an intangible asset that's made up of, you guessed it, brand and culture. So half the valuation of a company in its acquisition across all these industries is typically something related to brand and culture. That's an astonishing valuation metric. And two other studies by Deloitte and E&Y show how important purpose is to the performance of a company and its valuation. And purpose is a key attribute of both a healthy brand and culture. So in the Deloitte study, they found that companies that had a strong sense of purpose, that was socialized within the organization and well known, reported 50% higher levels of employee engagement. And E&Y similarly found that companies that prioritized purpose in their communications, in their brand, in the way their executives communicated with the staff, were far more likely to see 10% annual growth than companies that did not prioritize it. And another study by Jim Stengel, the former global marketing officer of P&G, showed that companies, the top 50 companies he studied that had a strong purpose and an aligned culture, outperformed the rest of the S&P by about 400%. And this was over a 12-year period that included 2 different recessions. And there's tons more data that show companies that have this strong purpose and an aligned culture and a healthier brand and culture working together have higher degrees of productivity, they're more creative, their sales and profits are higher, and they have less turnover. So there shouldn't be any doubt today that a healthy brand and culture can make a difference in the bottom line. Can a company perform well without them? Yes, for a period of time, but it usually catches up with them, as we saw in some of those examples up above.
Right, and another thought, you've got the great places to work listed here. One of the things that we experience with clients is that, an upside of a great culture is positive press. We've seen the impact of negative press coming from a bad culture, but a healthy culture drives a lot of positive feature stories, perhaps even magazine covers, based on outperforming the peers and having an exceptional culture.
Great point. Yep. Upside PR.
Yeah. Okay. So it's clear, obviously, JP painted a great picture that culture is really important. And I think it's fair to say, as human beings involved in business, that we already get that. We understand that at a gut level. And while the need to address a crisis is far less frequent than the day-to-day demands of running and growing a business, there are many more reasons to get clear on culture. And one of them, as so eloquently worded by Peter Drucker, is culture eats strategy for breakfast. We have all heard this before, but the question is, how do we get our arms around something that feels so intangible? And just the fact that everyone is focused on culture today doesn't make it any easier to define, because much of the time, culture operates underneath the surface, sort of at an unconscious level, and it shows up more in our behaviors. And we all know that actions speak louder than words. Here, we like to call them the unwritten rules of engagement, if you will, because they're not laid out on the company website or in brochures. They're not written into the handbook or the orientation program. And yet, these unwritten rules of engagement are the biggest drivers of success at multiple levels. They're kind of baked in, right? They're in our reward and recognition systems. They show up as part of the social norms. They're part of our performance expectations, and maybe, we get reviewed and rewarded monetarily based on them. So across the board, there are a lot of programs that identify these unwritten rules. I like to picture this sort of like a college freshman showing up on campus for the first time. They have no idea how much they stand out, but a seasoned player would look at them and pick them out like a sore thumb, especially those returning sophomores. They show up with almost like a swagger, and they operate with an entirely different level of comfort. Freshmen haven't internalized these unwritten rules of engagement, and it's going to take them some months before they realize that they don't fit in. They have to kind of learn the way we do things around here. And that's true for any organization. And the question becomes, how do we measure these unwritten rules? And back to Peter, because he also said that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And our bend on that, we'd like to add to that, if you can measure it, you can mold it. So what metric, what value can we use to measure culture? And that's where archetypes come in. Let me tell you a little bit more about them. Archetypes were first postulated by psychiatrist Carl Jung. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine, back in the time of Freud. And it was his belief that all human beings are guided by this same inner roadmap, and that we use that to make sense of our own lives through a common set of beliefs and behaviors. He taught us that these patterns had been with us since the dawn of time. And we've seen them, and we can see them reflected not only in historical documentation and cultures, but we find them showing up in art and literature, in myth and religion, and we can see them just as easily in Aboriginal tribes as well as today's movies and advertising. More recently, a woman named Carol Pearson took Jung's work with archetypes and created a framework of 12 patterns that she found recurred most often. And she went on to identify that those 12 patterns show up in individuals as well as in organizations.
Teresa, I would like to add here that this is one of the things that I found so fascinating and attracted me to this system. As a brand person, I was aware of archetypes in advertising. We've seen them for close to 100 years now. You can think of Budweiser being the king of beers as an example of a ruler brand. But I'd never really seen them present or measurable in the culture of an organization. And we were always looking for a way to link the two. And I think this is one of the most powerful and intuitive ways to do that. And really what kind of drew me to this framework in the first place.
Yeah, I think, I like to think about it as a shortcut. It's a quick way to help us understand what's intangible or unwritten.
Yep.
So let's take a look at Wells Fargo a little bit and play this out. We're going to use Wells Fargo this morning as our example because what went wrong there has already been well documented. You're probably familiar with it. We're going to share why it went wrong in a brief culture audit using archetypes as our guide. So how did the frontline employees digest the unwritten rules at Wells Fargo to mean that they had the liberty to fabricate millions of unauthorized accounts? And how could this happen at such a well-established institution with a culture that was rooted, purportedly in strength and trust? So what we're going to share is really how the unethical employees were not the cause of the problem. As a matter of fact, they were the effect of the problem. A recent Fortune magazine interview of the new Wells Fargo CEO, Tim Sloan, says that the company is committed to fixing everything that's broken and creating a better company culture. But to intentionally create a new culture, it's critical to understand where you are starting from. And it's not that simple because the company's worst features were, in many ways, the same patterns that were responsible for its overwhelming success. So let's start by taking a look at what may have been at play, some of the patterns that may have been showing up in the Wells Fargo culture. We're using this as an example based on an external analysis. So full disclosure, we did not do a survey of the Wells Fargo staff, but we do see evidence, and we see evidence of the hero, the ruler, and the revolutionary patterns. And each one has strengths and then some unintended shadows that also show up. So let's break it down a little bit. The root of the scandal can actually be found to one prominent segment of the company's business, and that was the retail banking unit. And there we see evidence of the hero archetype, complete with a drive to win at all costs. There was like a hard-charging sales culture and an obsession with cross-selling. And the internal call to action was go for great. And that was spelled GR with the number 8. And that was the name of a sales effort to actually encourage people to sell 8 products to every customer. And it inspired employees to drive hard toward an unprecedented level of success. So clearly, on many levels, it worked. The average bank sells about 2.7 products to every customer, and Wells Fargo was averaging an unheard of 6.1. They were transformed from the country's number 9 bank in the late 90s, operating largely in California, to the top performing bank in the country in 2015. And they were the envy of the industry. But this also had some unfortunate side effects, and they show up as the shadow side of the hero archetype. And there were warning signs years before the culture imploded. For instance, sales results, which are due sort of every month in many organizations, were called for almost as often as every hour in some cases at Wells Fargo. Can you imagine being part of that team? And winners, were publicly celebrated, but those who performed at lower levels were actually subjected to humiliation or demotion and sometimes even fired. And there were no excuses for those who didn't meet the quotas. So it's no surprise that turnover and burnout were high. The turnover was reported at 41% one year. And one employee is quoted in a lawsuit as saying that the managers constantly hound, berate, demean, and threaten employees to meet these unreachable quotas. So the very things that made the hero culture strong were also a challenge. But there was actually more at play. Let's take a look at the revolutionary that we believe was showing up. Wells Fargo is actually breaking the mold on banking with its retail banking unit, which was set up to operate more like a retailer than a bank. And even the language that they used created new rules. For instance, they talked about selling products versus servicing customers, and they worked at stores instead of branches. What the employees did, opening these accounts and issuing products that customers never asked for, was and is still against the written rules at Wells Fargo. But the revolutionary archetype, and when it's present, you can see here how it becomes acceptable to look the other way or shrug off the official guidelines. And the message also shifts dramatically when rule breakers are actually rewarded in an environment. And then remember that 41% employee turnover? That's almost expected in a retail environment. So what would ordinarily be cause for concern at most financial institutions, where stability and consistency are keys to success, went unaddressed. And one of the key consequences I'll point out on the revolutionary side here is a lack of awareness of what you are leaving in your wake. So not really seeing the consequences of your actions as they're happening. So how did these things go unnoticed? Especially by the higher ups in the corporation, where the top leaders were really underreacting to this for years. And perhaps that's where we see the ruler archetype showing up. At Wells Fargo, there are many positive aspects to this pattern that work on many levels. Recall, they did rise to the #1 position in the market, and that's indicative of a ruler archetype. And as well as, the strong deference to leaders. So each of those siloed business units, the leader was urged to run it like you own it. And they were given the power to rule over their own little fiefdoms within the bank. However, on the flip side of this, in this crisis, the shadow side of the ruler created a critical shortcoming through a culture that was top-heavy and slow to move. And it's also been revealed that the leaders of the retail banking unit didn't like to be challenged or hear negative information, and people were discouraged from airing contrary views. In a ruler culture, you definitely don't tell the emperor that he has no clothes. And compounding that was the fact that outside of the silo of the retail banking unit, there was a corporate bureaucracy so sprawling that there were really no clear lines of responsibility that could be drawn. So it's easy to see in hindsight how the culture at Wells Fargo went awry, and how the very things that make the organization strong can become glaring problems when you cross the line from the strength into the shadow side of a pattern. The new CEO does have his work cut out for him to right the ship, and any efforts to shift the culture are going to need to happen at a foundational level.
I hope that you guys see this case now in a different light through archetypes, and it's a very powerful framework for understanding what happened, or at least making some sense of it. And I keep finding myself wondering what would have happened had the leadership there been aware of these patterns in advance. Might they have avoided this entirely? So it's that 41% turnover to retail banking. It's astonishing. And that bringing that awareness to what's going on is part of what we're trying to do for our clients at Brand Foundation. So let's segue into, I'm going to take you guys through some practical examples of the ways we are putting this archetypal framework to use in the work that we're doing around brand and culture. So the first and most obvious way is just simply to make sure a client's brand reflects and is aligned with its culture. It's a very transparent world today with social media platforms, employer review sites, et cetera, and nothing undermines a public-facing brand faster than a culture that doesn't back up the promise. We clearly saw that in the examples above. Wells Fargo, which Teresa just took you through, a brand very much rooted in the trust of a leader and a ruler that was betrayed by a culture of win at all costs heroes and break the rules revolutionaries. But similarly, when we look at Uber, we see a brand that was lodged in the magician archetype and delighting people with what appears to be magic. Push a button, you get a car. It's incredible. But that culture was also undermined by some of the darker sides of the magician archetype, utilizing the technology to manipulate the drivers, to get around the authorities, a cult of personality that had grown up around the CEO. All of these things are downsides of the magician archetype, and we saw them all play out at Uber. So what we try to do is use archetypes to understand what is the dominant personality within this culture and make sure that the brand reflects it. And when everyone in the organization understands the personality, when this is socialized, when there's broad awareness of who we are and what our story is and what this personality is, both around the brand and the culture, people will act accordingly. And it provides a little bit of a system of checks and balances. And ultimately, the brand then becomes more authentic to outsiders because they see it backed up by the behaviors of employees. That's one very basic way we're applying it. The next way is to make us better storytellers, make our customers better storytellers. At the turn of the century, when Carl Jung theorized the existence of these archetypes, he believed that they were deeply rooted in our human psyche, likely as a result of tens of thousands of years of storytelling. Around the campfire, we're genetically predisposed to stories as human beings. We remember them. We pass them down far more readily than we do facts and figures. And today, modern science has proven that our brains are actually more activated and more effectively activated when we listen to a story than when we hear facts, including parts of the brain that are related to emotion. When you hear a story, you have traces of dopamine that are left and other chemicals along these neural pathways that are activated, and they aid in recall. And so understanding the archetype of an organization, of its culture, of its brand, we can help shape a narrative and a story that goes far beyond the product features and functions of what an organization sells, and can land on the ears of customers and employees with a lot greater emotional appeal. A story can drive engagement. When it's rooted in an archetype, it can drive a sense of belonging to a tribe and ultimately loyalty. And these are all goals of any company's brand or messaging. So that's the second way we're applying it. The third way is to better understand our clients' actual customers. Archetypes give us a framework for really understanding who the company is, but also who their customers are, and help to shape a brand that will connect with that audience. So if we take, for instance, two technology brands here, Apple and Microsoft. Both have deeply loyal customers historically, but both have very different archetypes and founding stories. So if we look at Apple, for an example, Steve Jobs founded that company, we believe, very much in the mold of a revolutionary. Think about the 1984, the very famous 1984 ad that ran one time during the Super Bowl. It was all about rebellion. Think about their tagline of "Think Different." That's about challenging the status quo, another attribute of a revolutionary archetype. In this case, they were challenging the status quo of IBM, whose brand has been rooted in 100 years around the theme and the essence of thinking. So we're going to think different. And to some degree, the Apple brand was lodged in the notion of being a little bit elitist. Think of the Crazy Ones ad that they rolled out when Steve Jobs first returned to the company. And so if you viewed yourself in these terms as a member of the audience, if you saw yourself as a revolutionary, as being a little bit rebellious, a little bit elitist, challenging the status quo, you probably gravitated towards their product and we're more loyal to them as a result. On the flip side, you have Microsoft, whose founder, Bill Gates, had a very different vision when he started the company. And that vision was a computer on every desktop. And it doesn't get any more democratic, or to use an archetypal term, every person, than that vision. And so if you saw yourself as more mom and baseball and apple pie than being a rebel and elitist, and think of the average IT guy that worked in an enterprise in the early 90s and early 2000s, I saw a lot of them, that's how they viewed themselves. You were probably more likely to buy from Microsoft and be more likely to be loyal to Microsoft as a result of that. And it's not that one vision was right or wrong, or one archetype was right or wrong. It all had to do with how the audience saw themselves. So understanding how that archetype of an organization, its culture, and its brand makes it easier to understand the customers that are going to be attracted to it, and to fine-tune your message and your offering to that audience. Another way we're using archetypes and thinking about them is to help shape a company's employer brand for recruiting purposes.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here and just share about this image as an example of that. This is a billboard that we created to support the employment brand at Wabash National. And the goal of the campaign was to reinforce the company's commitment to their people and to express their patriotic values. And you can feel that in the image, the pride and respect for service and duty, all of which are very well tied up in a hero archetype culture. And each of the folks who were part of this photo shoot are actually veterans who work for the company in various capacities. So they're using real people to express those values. The goal was to bolster the company's reputation in the community through billboards that were dispersed around the employment region, and also to attract like-minded people to apply for open positions. So it had two real purposes.
All right, and a great example of a hero archetype and having a deeper purpose, in this case, supporting the nation and veterans and that kind of a thing. And I think that's hugely important when we're in such a competitive recruiting landscape today that is largely dominated by the millennial generation. They're about 50% of the workforce today will be as much as 80% in the next 10 years or so. And they are largely driven by notions of purpose, more so than profit. So appealing to them is going to require more than a nice paycheck and some benefits. And we're using the archetype system to sort of identify the culture and make sure that's reflected in the recruiting materials, so that we're doing more than just saying we have a great culture. If you want to win those Great Place to Work awards, it takes more than just those benefits. You have to have that story and that sense of purpose. Archetypes really help to make that possible. We're actually working with a company right now. It's got about 10,000 employees in the financial services space, and there we were hired to look at their employer brand, and the recruiting message we saw largely centered around the benefits you would get from working there in training and development. Think of the SAGE archetype, becoming smarter, and then also advancement, the ability to advance and move up the organization to become a ruler. But in interviewing actually the recruiters and some of the people in the branches, what we were hearing was that they really saw themselves more as caregivers and heroes. They were serving an underserved population, and it was having financial hardship and providing loans for these folks that were allowing them to get a fresh start and get them out of hardship. And so shifting that message for them from an employer brand standpoint will, I think, help them attract the right kind of candidate and get those people to stay more and for longer. So that's a little bit about how we're using it in employment branding. And the next area is really around competitive analysis. We're now able, as a result of this certification and understanding the archetypal system, to look at the competitive landscape for our clients and identify what archetypes are being represented and how strongly in their competitors' websites and marketing materials. And often we will see everyone in a competitive landscape using the same language and emphasizing the same archetypes. And that gives us an opportunity, if we see a different one measured within our client's culture, to tell a different story, to really position them as different in the marketplace through the language that we're using, and create a personality that's different from everybody else. And often just sharing the archetypal framework and looking at their competitors through that lens is an eye-opener. We did this for an IT company earlier this year, and they were led by a very pedigreed management team that had a lot of experience in this space, decades of experience. They had seen dozens of different competitive analyses. They knew their competitors inside and out. They had never seen one done with an archetypal framework. And as a result, they found themselves, as we were going through this, almost laughing at how people they knew that worked at these companies fit that archetypal profile perfectly. So it was a real eye-opener for them and really caused them to look at the landscape differently than they had before and to position themselves differently. And then the last way we're thinking about the archetype system to help our clients is really related to M&A activity. Studies have shown that 83% or more of mergers fail to deliver a return that investors had expected. And the biggest reason is politics and groups jockeying for position in the face of job consolidation. But even when a merger has no impact on jobs, we've seen studies that show employee disengagement will go up after a merger by anywhere from 20 to 30%. Nothing will undermine the performance of a company faster than some kind of a merger acquisition. So how do archetypes help avoid this problem? Well, first, they could be used in planning and assessing a possible merger. In a perfect world, we think both companies would have used the archetypal platform to understand what's our dominant and latent archetypes, what are the behaviors that go along with those, and know in advance where the challenge is going to be with merging with one particular company or another. And they might even pass on a merger if they see really big differences in what the personality of those cultures are. But even if they don't do that and they've embarked on a merger, archetypes can provide a framework for the leadership team to understand as they begin the integration, what are the different cultures we have here? What's the shared narrative that's going to tie everybody together and get them all on the same page? And running a process rooted in this archetypal system gives all the employees a chance to have a voice in what that new culture or brand is going to be. And that can help to offset that disengagement that naturally comes in a merger when you feel a loss of control. So hopefully those examples give you a little bit of a sense of how we're using this system in the work that we're doing around brand and culture, and really benefiting both our practice and that of our clients as well. And with that, I'll flip it back to Teresa to talk a little bit more about the system itself.
Okay, so that was about the why and the how. Let's take a look at the actual framework. So we have, throughout the conversation today, referenced this framework of 12 patterns. And in the case study, we highlighted 3. We've talked about a few more. You might already be familiar with this grouping. We are far from the only ones who focus on this group of 12 archetypes and think about individuals and organizations being identified by one of these. And we think it's fun just, at a high level to look at the names of the archetypes themselves, because each one of them provides a clue as to what the pattern represents. So for example, looking at the caregiver, we all know people and organizations that represent the caregiver. That's the one that shows up and guides the way when the going gets tough, provides the maternal or the paternal protection that keeps us safe and on track. And similarly, we could have some quick understanding that comes out of just the names of each of these. So taking that a step further, here's a look at the CultureTalk system itself. And there's 2 tools. Each one of them is used in slightly different ways. And it's a flexible system. You can use them collaboratively or independent of one another. One of them measures organizational culture, and that's been our focus for today, talking about the shared values of a team. And you can see how that actual tool plays out. The second one, we'll share more about individual archetypes and the ways that can be used for leadership development, team building. There are lots of different ways to use that one, and we'll be inviting you to a follow-on webinar sometime in the fall to learn more about that. So there's some ways that the tools can be used in collaboration to even strengthen further the impact of using archetypes in your organization. The tools themselves are responsive and can be accessed from any device, from desktop to smartphone. And the interface makes the surveys interesting and fun, and we get a lot of great feedback on people who just enjoy going through the survey itself. This is a quick snapshot of the organizational report that gets generated when an entire group takes the survey. And it shows how they measure as a whole and can also be broken down into various demographic slices.
Yeah, I want to add here that the ability to slice and dice the data here by department, which origin company they came from, is hugely valuable and has allowed us to see some really interesting differences between groups within an organization in that M&A activity. Really, really powerful.
Okay, and here's just a quick peek at the Culture Talk for Individuals online report. This survey is available for purchase one at a time directly on the Culture Talk website, or it can be purchased in groups, and it gives you an automatic result. It's generated this report, which is created through this online interface, and then we also have the ability to download a PDF of your results, from the personal survey. And then last but not least, we have a certification program. JP has come through that program and obviously is really enjoying a benefit to his business as a result of having gone through that. And we'd like to share with you, and we're excited to say that we've got 3 sessions coming up this fall. One is in New York City in September. We've got Orlando in October and Saratoga Springs, New York in December. The 2-day intensive training, and we've got a growing community of partners who are sharing in the use of the system and other supporting tools, and being able to apply this to their own organizations and client companies.
And having gone through this, I will tell you it is a great investment of 2 days. Materials are fantastic. The exercises we did there were great, and I literally walked out of there ready to put this to work in our practice, and felt very comfortable with the framework. So highly recommended for anybody who's doing work in brand and culture and wants to use Archetypes.
Right, and also we're making available to you a white paper that JP and Brand Foundations put together. And this is an awesome opportunity to take some of the data and the details that we shared early on in the webinar that can help you to prove the case to your C-suite and or your client companies around the value of doing this type of work. So a lot of detail and data that can support the case. And I think that's a very interesting piece of content and urge you to take advantage of that as well.
Absolutely.
Teresa and JP, thank you so much. I want to actually open up the session here to any questions that may have come up for you during the presentation. I have been taking note of a couple of questions in the chat panel, and we have a couple to get started with, but if you have an additional question, I'd encourage you to send a message here in the chat panel, and we'll address your question as well. So let me start with a question that came in about the organizational survey, the culture audit. And the question is, when you're running an organizational survey, does everyone in the company need to participate?
Okay.
Well,
I'll answer that first, and yeah, let's also hear what you think. But so one of the things JP touched on around the organizational survey is the impact that it can have simply to ask the employees to participate. And sometimes when we're taking a look at culture and we ask someone's opinion, the opportunity to weigh in and share, whether it be through the survey itself or for a follow-on validation that takes place, getting those employees engaged is really important. So we feel like the more people that you engage and ask to participate in the survey, the better the overall impression that you create with the work. It could be that you don't have that ability, and you might need to have a representative subset of people taking the survey. So it depends on the situation.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the more people you have touch it, the benefit of having been participated in it is greater, which is always a core tenet of what we believe. Everybody needs to have a voice because they're more likely to embrace the brand afterwards if it's built from, or the brand or the culture, if it's built from the inside out as opposed to top down. However, we have had some situations where a client has been putting together after a merger, a brand culture integration team, and they might have 20 people or so that they feel represent the best of the organization, and this is what they want to model going forward. And we've used the tool with them to understand what their archetypes are and allow them to champion that going forward. So we have had success, even when it hasn't been everybody in the organization, but I think it's always better to err on that side.
Got it. So ideal is to get as much participation as possible, knowing that the situation varies from company to company.
Right. Yeah.
Here's a second question, and is it again about the organizational survey? When you get the results of the survey and you get an archetypal profile, how do you know that those results are valid in the report?
Yeah, that's a great question. We always feel like this entire process is really about awareness. And so going back and validating and raising awareness about why the patterns showed up and asking some more qualitative questions to reinforce what we're seeing so that each pattern shows up in, it could be generic in its statement, but adding the specific stories and the validation points from the employees and other stakeholders and for the organization as well. So depending on the group that you're surveying, you could be talking to trustees, customers or clients. There could be other people who see the brand from the outside and have a lot to say and share from their perspective. So that validation process really brings a lot of richness and value to the survey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add that when we're always comparing this is one data point. And we try to think about brand and culture development as a 360-degree process. And so we're always comparing what we saw in the survey and what archetypes are revealed with interviews with stakeholders throughout the organization, customers outside and business partners outside, and even, again, looking at the competitive landscape so that we can compare what we see in the survey to statements we heard internally. And when you do that, it's incredibly powerful. When you could back it up by here's what people in your organization actually said in interviews that demonstrate that archetype, it's really drives home the point, and they see themselves in it much more powerfully. So that's how we're validating and making sure that we see it in other places.
Okay, so it sounds like validation is an important part of the process in using the survey work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think. Yeah, with any survey or data point, you have to compare it to, some real life kind of color commentary stuff. I agree.
Okay, I have another question that just came in. It says, I want to share what I learned today with my team. If I were to boil it down to the most important message you want to share, what is it? Is it that culture impacts finances and archetypes can be the answer, or what would be the most important point?
That's a great
tough one.
Well, I'll take a stab at
Yeah.
that. I think the most important point is is awareness. You need to know who you are authentically throughout the organization, not just at the leadership level, but you need to know what collectively the organization believes it is, because that is the understanding that unwritten rule is what is ultimately going to come through outside the organization and will affect the financial performance. But it's about awareness and knowing those unwritten rules, what's really being told here. Because no matter what you say, as leadership, you can stand up there and say till you're blue in the face, you can trust us, we're a trustworthy brand, blah, blah, blah. But if that's not backed up by the reality of how people see themselves and how they're behaving internally, it won't last.
Right. And I'll just add to that by saying there's real ROI in that. So being able to bring that level of awareness at an authentic level to an organization will deliver in many different ways to the bottom line, whether it's looking at employment, brand, and recruiting and retention, and the cost of that, actual valuation, the improved performance of a merger and acquisition. There are just so many ways that getting it right drives, some real value for an organization. So I think that that's critical and key as well.
And conversely, getting it wrong can cost you tremendously.
That's right.
As has been shown. Okay. Let me go with one more question here. We're almost to the end of our hour. Question is, if you did this survey and then did it again in the future, 6 months or a year from now, would you expect an organization's cultural archetypes to change over time?
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
The way I've addressed that with some customers that have asked is that, first of all the archetypes typically show up in an organization. If you survey enough people, you're going to see evidence of all of them there. But you're looking for the patterns of which ones are the strongest. And that can change over time, but I think they tend to be pretty consistent. And what will change it, though, and where I think it would make sense over time, is when there is a significant change in the population of the organization, either its makeup or the number of people. That could be because they had very rapid growth. We've all heard of companies that grew very quickly, had a great culture when they were small, when the founder could get his hands around it, really shape the culture and influence it. And then when you get to 100, 200, 300 employees, you start to lose that personal touch. Over 1,000 employees, the CEO can't really know everybody and can't have that influence. And then something goes awry. So I think either fast growth or clearly in a merger, when you bring in a significant, could be a small acquisition, but when you bring in a significant other entity, at that point you might want to conduct another survey to see how are they fitting in. But that, and over time, of course, I think one of the things that attracted us to this platform is that we knew we could use it to go back to clients a year later or 18 months later and say, hey, let's resurvey again and make sure you guys are still staying true to that brand. That's how we've chosen to look at it.
Right. And I'll also add, back to the Wells Fargo example, that when you're really intending to shift or to change the culture and you've got some strong reasons to do that, it's a great way to look and see if you've hit your target. So not only can we measure what's present today, so sort of, from point A to point B, so what is point A, we can measure that, and then we can create a roadmap that helps to drive us toward a new culture, some stronger conclusions, as well as to understand where are we going from the strength to the shadow side of a pattern. So there are lots of different ways you can use the measure from that regard.
Got it. Well, I think it's time to wrap up here. We're just a few minutes before the top of the hour. Let me say again to everybody who joined us, thank you so much for spending an hour of your day learning about brand and culture and archetypes. Teresa and JP, thanks for a great explanation. And for everybody on the phone, we will have an email going out afterwards with a special offer with a link to the presentation, as well as a link to JP's white paper that he shared earlier. So big thank you and a great day to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.